Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. First speaker after the dinner last night, huh? Yeah, Simon Breakspeare's favourite professor, goodness me. Mind you, Simon Breakspeare's probably busy this morning, isn't he? Yeah. A new father for a second time. So, Professor, yes. Hopefully, this is not going to be like the professor back home who said to his students, if you had an hour left to live, where would you like to spend that hour? And one student put up their hands and said, well, in your class, of course. And he said, oh, why is that? And he said, well, in your class, an hour is like an eternity. So, flat white in hand, I have to say, nobody makes flat whites like the Aussies make flat whites. So, creating capacity for learning. This is my strapline down in the bottom right of the slide. It's what I hope and aspire, that's a good word, to do, and it's what I have a passion about trying to help others to do. I have been described by an academic colleague who was introducing me at a conference as a pracademic. And I'm not sure it was supposed to be a compliment. I took it as such because I'm absolutely passionate about the bridge between research and practice and trying to help practitioners bridge research and practice and make the best use of it. I want to focus this morning on why I think capacity for learning is absolutely critical right now. I'm sure that you will be familiar with many of the arguments, but I'm going to rehearse those. And then I want to move on to some messages for leaders and for leadership. And so we, of course, are in the business, and our governments, whether they are state or national governments around the world, and our own passion is for ensuring the very best quality, but also for any of you who haven't been to London and been on the Underground and seen this familiar sign at some stations between the platform and the tube train, mind the gap. We need to mind the gap. We need to be sure that we are making a difference in terms of learning for all of our children and young people, whatever cultural background, social class background, whether they are girls or boys, whether they are younger or older, and in whatever subject discipline or whatever aspect of learning. We need to take care of that gap and be sensitive to that gap for every learner. But we are doing that in an environment which is changing, has changed. These are only some of the changes, with people living longer, with our concerns for the environment, with changes in terms of patterns of people moving into the cities, with you in Australia with a very particular relationship with Asia and the implications of that. And perhaps most noticeable of all, and I am looking around the room, and I include myself in this, for some of us at least, we could not consider ourselves to be digital natives. So for those very tiny children for whom picking up an iPad is like popping a piece of bread into a toaster, it is just something that we do without thinking. And even for Professor Sugata Mitra, when he was in India, putting a computer in a village, in a hole in the wall, and watching to see what happened, and children taught each other. They taught themselves, they taught each other. And from that, he's now in Newcastle, England, and he is taking his work further and taking on the intergenerational challenge. He has grannies in a cloud who are supporting children in other countries in their learning. So we have many changes, and what that means for us is, as Dorothy said to Toto, when the house stopped spinning and landed in The Wizard of Oz, she came out into this brightly multicolored world and said, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto." And we aren't in Kansas. And so all around the world, as we know, there is a focus on 21st century skills. I'm wondering when we're going to start calling them 22nd century skills or something, being in the year 2015 already, 15 years in. And your own national curriculum has got 7 capabilities that stretch across the curriculum. And elsewhere, we see, for example, them described as survival skills, adaptive, creative thinking, being entrepreneurial. Many of you will have come across the work of Zhong Xiao, who comes to Australia quite often. Recently, I came across, from the Institute for the Future, this list of the key skills and capabilities needed, several of which we have talked about already, but so much more about being able to connect up the dots, to make sense across different kinds of disciplines, to be able to see the big picture within transdisciplinarity, not to stay focused in your narrow one area, but to be a generalist in terms of that. In terms of the new media literacy and computational thinking, yes, we know we need to be able to analyze, to be able to sift, to sort, to be able to critically sort our way through. And that second to last one, how many of us on a, more than daily basis are suffering from cognitive load? And that's one of the big issues in a conference for engaging in empowering principals and their staff. How do we deal with all of that big load? And how do we bring a design mindset that contains empathy? Because what we're doing is we're trying increasingly to be thinking about, in business they would say, the user. In schools we're saying, how do we bring students in helping us understand better what our schooling should be about? So it's a big, big change. And then along with that, and one of your capabilities, is the fact that we are in this interconnected world where cross-cultural competence is so important. I was looking at an article just the other day in the Harvard Business Review, which is called "How to Say This Is Crap in Different Cultures," and came across something by Nanette Rietmeester, where she was doing a comparison and saying, we have to be very careful when we're talking to colleagues from other cultures that everybody understands what everybody else means. I'm very sensitive to that myself. They say that the US and England are 2 countries divided by a common language. Here, my favorite expression here is "it's a big ask," and thankfully we're beginning to adopt that. But a lot of people in England, if you say that, are still, what does that mean? But Nanette said that the difference between the Dutch and the Brits is very interesting. So here's just one example, and it's true, very interesting. When we Brits say, "That's very interesting," what we actually mean about an idea is, "I don't like it." But the Dutch understand us to mean they're impressed. So we have to be really sensitive to all of those changes. That's what's happening in the world out there. That's what's happening in the world where a young person from Generation Z may have 17 or more different kinds of work in 5 careers, in jobs that haven't even been created. And they have to be adaptive. They have to be curious. But also, we must never, ever forget, and this is at the heart, I know, of this conference as well, we must never forget about our mental well-being, but also our social well-being. Because so much of this, the social intelligence, the virtual collaboration, so much of this is about us connecting in a social world and what it means to be human and relationships. And even though it's from quite a while ago, I still go back to the Beatles song, "I Get By with a Little Help from My Friends." In fact, if you carry on with the words of that, it does also include "I get high with a little help from my friends," which I'm not suggesting this morning. So that's what we need, and we know we have lots of information to inform us about what wonderful learning is. This is just one take on it, and this comes from the OECD's Innovative Learning Environments Initiative. And they asked academics from around the world to pull together the findings on effective learning. Simon, I understand, yesterday said, find a spark for young people. Generally, when you find a spark, it's because they are at the center of their learning. They are taking control of their learning. They are self-regulated. And they are involved in the sorts of inquiry, project-based learning, problem-based learning, authentic learning that helps respect the fact that learning is social, that we learn together, so they learn collaboratively. I don't know how true this is for many of you. For me, when I was at school, if I was cooperating with another student, I was cheating. It's not cheating, it's smart. It's smart, we get ideas, we can discuss, we can dispute, we can build our collective intelligence. We know that emotions are critical to learning. We know that no one, whether they are a little child or a big child like all of us in the room, if we're anxious, we can't learn. The brain is involved, the amygdala, we just shut down. So yes, we need to stretch all students, we need to have high expectations, but at the same time, we need to give them the kinds of scaffolds and facilitate the learning and opportunities with peers and the kind of feedback that all the best research on the assessment for learning tells us. And we need to recognize the individual differences and that how stretching one child is not the same in the way that we stretch another child. But really critically, we need to make those horizontal connections with their lives. We need to be able to connect to the things that are going on outside for them. And for many of them, that is their relationship with technology, with gaming, with connecting. Many of them are very entrepreneurial, as we know. We've got many young business people. We need to be able to make those kinds of connections, and their connections, their passion for the environment, their passion for doing good, for supporting, giving them community opportunities. Now, that is the big ask. That is the really big ask. And how around the world this is being interpreted, and this comes through in one of the reports from the OECD, is that teachers need now to be in charge of creating knowledge, of being able to access, create, pull things together, advancing their own knowledge to be knowledge workers. I'm really interested in language, and one thing I do recommend, you'll have your own favorite uses of language, but not to go back into school when you do and tell everyone, now it's time to become a knowledge worker. It's not my favorite expression, but advancing their own knowledge, but also notice they're not just responsible for themselves. We're not responsible only for our own learning. We have a responsibility to learn on behalf of others. You are here for your own nourishment, for your own learning, for your own connections, but you're also here for others. You're here for the students, you're here for their families, you're here for teachers. And so what that means, as Andrea Schleicher says, is that we need teachers who are confident. And when you read this report, and he has pulled from all of the reports from the Improving School Leadership, from the Innovative Learning Environments, from the TALIS studies, it means that teachers need to collaborate with each other. That is in your teacher standards. That teachers need to be advancing and investigating their practice, and that they need to be able to have the confidence and the willingness to try new things, to innovate. But that can't happen, and it says school leaders, and I don't think it is just school leaders. I think it's leaders at all levels of the system, because they enable school leaders. And when we talk about school leaders, I'm also talking about distributed leadership, both principals, assistant principals, deputy principals, middle leaders, teacher leaders, who are establishing conditions that will enable the others to flourish. When you have those kinds of conditions, you feel empowered. You have capacity for learning, so that when this situation, this path you're going on, keeps on changing, you are able to keep going there, because you're able to learn and unlearn and relearn and ditch what's not useful to you. You're able to apply your learning. And that requires you to take care of yourselves as well, and I will be talking about that as well. So for me, from my own work over the last few years, merging work that I have been doing over the last few years, I see this as it's really important that we have creative professional learning communities. I'm quite concerned, there's a lot of interest right around the world now in professional learning communities, with recommendations from the TALIS studies, and I started studying professional learning communities in England about 15 years ago, and we were looking initially at within schools, and also we started looking beyond schools as well, sometimes known as network learning communities, networks, partnerships, and so on. And I'm very concerned that these have become, in many jurisdictions, just mandated times when teachers have to get together to look at data and to analyze data and sit and are mandated around how they use the time. Because a professional learning community is a culture. It is collaborative, it is open, it is risk-taking, but it's also inclusive. People feel respected, they feel trusted, they feel good about what they're doing. They feel collectively responsible. The photo on the top right comes from Khayelitsha, a township in South Africa, and this is collective responsibility, Ubuntu, as Desmond Tutu talks about it. And that collective responsibility, which is a personal professional accountability, but it's a mutual accountability to others. We don't need an inspector from outside to tell us what is right, because we know, because we're investigating our practice, because we are drawing on evidence, we are creating evidence of our own, and we're getting deeper into our practice. And I spend a lot of time when I am in places like Australia, staying in hotels, and it's very reassuring to go into my room and to put up the sign that says, "Do not disturb outside my door." And I can shut myself away from the world. Well, that's not appropriate in education. In schools are not places where we deprivatize practice. Schools are places to share practice, to learn with and from each other, and to support each other, to create knowledge about best practice that we can then share and support others in learning from and with us. Why are we doing it? We're doing it because we know it makes a difference. There are findings when learning communities are focused on authentic learning experiences and teachers interrogating their practice and investigating, that it has a positive effect on students' outcomes. But we're not only looking at NAPLAN outcomes, what we're looking about is those future capabilities for the future. But on top of that, we know from our research that it makes a difference to teachers and leaders. It creates leadership capacity, and it also makes teachers not only grow in terms of their practice, but it improves morale in schools. Schools where this is part of the way of life feel better about what they're doing. So we have to think about the sustainability feature. We have to think, how can we get deeper in our understanding of learning, in our understanding of the kind of learning that is going to create that spark in pupils, in teachers, in all of us. Spread that as widely as possible so that it becomes contagious and we get to that tipping point that Malcolm Gladwell talked about. And also, how can we have that last over time without depleting our energy and our resources? I want to go through 5 messages that I think come as a result of this, some of which I think will have been rehearsed by other speakers. You may well have read a lot about this. I know that there's a lot of attention being paid to the work that's coming out of New Zealand and other places. A lot of these are also from my work and from my gathering from my experiences internationally over the last number of years. So, collaborative inquiry, which leads to deep and powerful professional learning. The whole issue of how, when we've got great knowledge, how do we circulate it? Growing change catalysts, and I'm particularly interested in middle leaders, teacher leaders, but of course that would apply to the students as well. Stimulating creativity and making sure that we take care of well-being and nourishing that. So first of all, collaborative inquiry. And I always think of 3 interconnected strategies. I'm involved at the moment for our Department for Education in evaluating its progress, the system's progress towards evidence-based teaching. Now, I'm interested in language. And as far as I'm concerned, if we're thinking about empowering people, then using the word evidence-based, for me, doesn't open it up enough. Evidence-informed, yes, we want to be informed professionals, but for me, we bring a lot. We bring our own experience anyway, so enriching our experience with evidence. And there are 3 interconnected ways, collecting and using data, and not just using data because data is given to us, being purposeful about what we want to collect in terms of data. Drawing on external research that can help us, and also carrying out forms of collaborative inquiry and research and development. And I'll be, in my workshop, I'm going to be talking more about that one. These are just some examples, one from England and one from Norway, of people who've looked at different ways of gathering data. On the right-hand side, Ruth Deakin Crick, and she was working with Guy Claxton as well in terms of the whole areas of building learning power, looking at different ways that you can collect information from teachers, from students, about different aspects of the learning power, of their resilience, of their creativity, their orientation to critical thinking, and so on, and then feeding that back in a way that they can use it and think about it. And on the left-hand side, I'm involved in one of the most exciting projects that I have had the pleasure to be involved in, a Norwegian Research Council project with Connexus, where they have a whole platform of not only the national assessments, but they're creating a whole range of different tools to help schools, and working with a range of different school leaders and system leaders in order to find out different ways, to find great processes to use these tools. This particular one is one that looks for an individual pupil and then for a school at the difference between support and challenge. And those bubbles there talk about either high support, low challenge, low support, low challenge, low support, high challenge, and so on. All enabling conversations about learning. And those data are not available publicly. They are just available to teachers or to schools. Research findings that can be accessible. In one of the projects that I worked in, one of the secondary schools used to put a postcard in everybody's locker once a week, research of the week, and it would be something about a strategy, for example, for critical thinking. And then they would have a conversation about it once a week at a briefing time. This is from a project that I've just completed with middle leaders, and we've been looking at mechanisms of knowledge exchange. And one of the things that we've done is we have co-designed cards. This is two sides of the card, and in this particular instance, there's a quote from the research, and on the back, as you see, there's an opportunity for you to have a conversation about the quote. So why don't you just take the first two questions there, and why don't you just, for a couple of minutes, are you able to read that quote? I'll read it out. Work settings are language communities. All leaders are leading language communities. Though every person in every setting has some opportunity to influence the nature of the language, leaders have exponentially greater access and opportunity to shape, alter, or ratify the existing language rules. What does that mean to you, and how does it relate to your current experience? Why don't you just chat to the person, two people next to you? Okay, if you could just wind up what was a very quick conversation. You'll see the last point there is how might you support other colleagues in engaging with research findings. That research that you choose could be something, for example, on mindfulness, on research on well-being, whatever. Opportunities to find research, just a small quote, getting those conversations going so that people can start to develop that shared language. And the third area, and I'm going to be focusing on this more in the workshop, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, and you can also, I will send through references to this, and also you can get this from the Centre for Strategic Education. I've written a paper for them on this. So this is about collaborative R&D and focusing on research and development within and between schools, focusing this importantly on areas that are really important to you as groups of schools. And our teaching school alliances who were involved in this, 98 of them around England out of the 500, said that they were most interested in exploring what is great pedagogy that leads to great student learning, student experience, well-being, what's great professional development that leads to consistently great pedagogy, and what's great leadership within, between, across schools that leads to that. And that is drawing on what's known in the research and drawing on data, but then coming up with their own findings to circulate to others. And what is most significant about this is that through carrying out this kind of research, it has really challenged people's thinking. And one of the findings of the literature review that I carried out for the second strand, which was the strand on professional development, is that effective professional learning changes people as part of the process. It's not just about tips for teachers that will help them start a lesson better. It's about them making new meaning. So it challenges thinking as a fundamental part of changing practice. It's not only visible in our practice, but in how we think about our practice. And as Stephen Katz and Lisa Dack from Canada say, it actually interrupts our assumptions. Very good book, that, Interrupting Assumptions, well worth looking at. Here is an example of a teacher who was involved in an inquiry process based on the work of Judy Hulbert and Linda Kayser in British Columbia in Spirals of Inquiry, where they're actually asking students questions about their learning. And this teacher, you can see what has happened, and as we track through, she had fundamentally changed her way of thinking about how students learn and about what was best for students. And she said, as a result, I now listen much more carefully. The advice we got from the teachers involved in the pilot of this through Whole Education, a network in England, was listen, listen, listen to students. I'm not going to stop for this question right at the moment, but a takeaway question for you is how professional learning challenges teachers' assumptions. How do you know it challenges teachers' assumptions? So when you have great knowledge, and when you have developed findings for yourselves, when you have something great, how do you circulate that knowledge amongst others? How do you help others to understand? And from our research and others' research, we really now know much more about this, about thinking about, are you just, it's almost like marketing, are you trying to get people aware of it? Are you just trying, for example, through Twitter, in particular, things like that, to help people, draw people's attention to something so that they can follow something up? Are you trying to engage them, to inspire them, to light that spark that will help them take it further? Are you wanting them to use the findings? And for me, that's about animating the knowledge. That is what I try and do when I create materials to help others engage, so that people can explore the ideas in relation, explore the practices in relation to their own context. It helps them reflect, it challenges their thinking, and it helps them articulate tacit knowledge and beliefs, helps them socially to come to a common understanding. So what we do, for example, on the top left there, this is work we've done with leadership teams. This was in one of our creative leadership projects, and we gave them a load of photographs. We asked them to bring photographs as well. We asked them to bring photographs about learning, about leadership, about creativity, and then to craft questions to help them analyze what was important to them. On the left-hand side, there are teachers looking at data, and then of course there could be many other stimuli. Many of these will be through social media, through uses of technology. And what you're doing there is you are surfacing on the left-hand side the tacit knowledge, because very often people don't talk about what they know. They don't articulate what they know. And you bring that together with that external knowledge, with knowledge from research, with knowledge from great practice elsewhere, in a stimulus for a learning conversation, with different mechanisms, for example, those questions on the back of that card, that help them to get to what photographers would call double exposure. Here you can see the tree, you can see the hands. What you're seeing is whether it's a piece of students' artwork, whether it's a research quote, but it's helping you interrogate your own practice. And that requires people getting deeper into conversations and challenging each other in their conversations. Now, I came to Australia a couple of years ago, and I was working with APA, the Primary Principals Association, on how we use conversations and learning conversations with the teacher standards. And I did a bit of homework before I went there to look at all the conversations that we have. We have difficult conversations, hard conversations, open to learning conversations, challenging conversations. I'm talking about true mutually equal conversations, peer-to-peer conversations, learning conversations. But those are hard to have very often because we stay in what Elizabeth City and colleagues call the land of nice. We don't like to move out and challenge each other's thinking, maybe because we're afraid that someone will ask us what we think, and maybe we don't know how to articulate that. So we have to get ourselves out of the land of nice. We have to create conditions where people can talk to each other. We have to help people create the dialogic skills to question, to be open, to synthesize, to listen carefully. And we need to put them in the kind of convivial situations. This is an 18th century English coffee house where people notoriously had stimulating conversations. And finding your equivalent of the coffee house. So moving knowledge around is really important to be able to create those kinds of conversations and to create those mutual relationships where people can interrogate each other. My third area is growing change catalysts. And I've been involved in a project in the last year or so, working with middle leaders across a network, working in partnership with this network, 300 schools, challenge partners. It's an informal network, or school leaders generated this one themselves around the country, and they support each other. One of the things they do is they carry out reviews in each other's schools. The senior leaders and principals go out and they review each other's schools. But they wanted to create a network, and so we worked with them to try and help them and support them learn more about change, to help them facilitate learning, to help them develop better connections and understand better how to circulate knowledge. Here you see a photograph. We had just done some work with them about using social networking theory. There's a lot of theory out there about how there are people in our schools who are very influential, and teachers go particularly to certain teachers in our schools. We have another project now where we have identified some of these and are working with them and senior leaders in research learning communities led by my colleague Chris Brown. And here, these teachers have been working on this, have been looking at different kinds of adopters who some who move quickly to innovation and new ideas, some of whom are more reticent. We like to call them the convertible skeptics, and some of whom are, for whatever reason, downright resistant. In Canada, when I lived there, we tended to have a term called "don't water the rocks." Now I think we are much more sophisticated about that, knowing that we would never say that about children, that finding ways to help support our colleagues is much better. But these middle leaders were given, I don't know if you have jelly babies in Melbourne, but they were given jelly babies. We gave them matches, we gave them paper clips, we told them find any other resources you want and find ways that you can convey how you are going to move knowledge that you've learned. It was a pretty successful activity, although unfortunately there were fewer jelly babies by the end of the activity. So what they worked on, we worked with them on finding ways to help track impact. This is a cycle of how they work with teachers. This came from us sharing information about what we know about looking at the impact of professional learning and the work of Helen Timperley, the work of Judy Holbert and Linda Kayser, all the work about starting with the end in mind, starting with students, coming to a shared understanding. And then they worked on this and they came up with a range of ideas which I have pulled together here. Having, as you notice, constantly supportive learning conversations where you identify the baseline of where you are and the strategies. You use research to help feed into the ideas and then try out approaches, but you keep coming back together to support, to identify the barriers and then refine approaches before you look at the evidence of change. What you don't see here is the evidence of change for the children and young people. They have got that. The particular funder wanted to look at the evidence of change on teachers, so this is the cycle about that. But we also asked them to think about how far had they managed to reach, how deep had they managed to reach in terms of thinking about how are we connecting, how are we sharing our knowledge with others. These different coloured dots are related to connecting with teachers in their schools, and those are the purple ones, with middle leaders in their schools, with their own principal, and with teachers in other schools. How are they making connections? Getting them to think more about how they make connections and how they build trust. And we are now at a stage where we are prototyping cards that we have designed, again, to help leaders use the findings and develop other leaders. Stimulating creativity is also absolutely critical to all of this. The reason I came to this was I evaluated our implementation of our national Key Stage 3 strategy, that was 11 to 14-year-olds. And I also looked at the findings of the National Numeracy and Literacy Strategy in primary schools that our Canadian colleagues evaluated. And what we found is that teachers were becoming rather dependent. Principals were saying to us, the teachers have become dependent. They're telling us just tell us what to do. There were wonderful strategies, but the teachers were not using them to create new ideas. And we were concerned because of all the changes and the importance in being adaptive and creative. And we asked them what the greatest risk teachers take when they're experimenting with practice. We did 300 interviews in 2 projects. And we found that people would say, if I experiment with my practice on a Wednesday afternoon, on a wet Wednesday, and if I innovate, the children will fail their exams The Ofsted inspectors will come in and fail us. I'm going to feel foolish. And so they then thought about it, and they realized that it was absolutely critical for them to be able to innovate. So we were working with the leadership teams and taking them into situations where they were looking at learning for the future. They all had teaching policies, they had curriculum policies, they had assessment policies, but they didn't often think about what is it that we think about in terms of learning. And so we got them thinking about that. We got them working with a composer, with a poet. We got them working with business, with other people from outside, with futurists. And then we asked them to design a project, and they had to apply 4 different rules, and you can see the rules here, including rules where they didn't have a leadership role, where students became co-designers, where they involved convertible skeptics, where they transferred ideas from one to another place. And here is one very traditional secondary school, and what they are doing here is they're coming up with their own learning policy, their learning wheel. They spent a day talking about learning, designing learning. They put posters up around the schools. They asked students to feed into this. They eventually came up with their learning wheel. They had students researching aspects of this, students advising the leadership team, and students observing teachers in classrooms using this. As long as they were invited by the teachers, but several teachers, increasing numbers of teachers, took up the opportunity. If you don't have a DNA in your school that is creative, how can students be creative? So, when do you feel at your most creative? What helps you? Please just chat to the person next to you. Okay, thank you. Again, this is what we found out from our project, very much confirmed by research outside education. People like Teresa Amabile are doing a lot of work in this area. And just how important it is to be creative and to be able to model that creativity and risk-taking, obviously sensible risk-taking, but not putting the pressure cooker. The one that the principals found most difficult, they told us, was letting go, self-consciously letting go. The buck stops with them, but really trying to take risks, using failure as learning. As we know from Albert Einstein, anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. I don't know if you know the Dyson vacuum cleaners. James Dyson's the man who does those dryers when you go into the washrooms. You put your hands in and the vacuum, it was 600 to 700 iterations. Now, I know that for the children it's the only time they have, for the young people it's the only time they have, but we have to try things. We have to have a place where it feels safe, where there are opportunities to get together, to be on your own, where the practicalities are facilitated, and where people get exposed to new ideas, to new thinking, while we stay true to where we're going. So we have to push people out of their comfort zone. We have to try and push people into the learning zone. We have to go into the learning zone. Of course, when we go into the panic zone, we're often in trouble. So one more question for you. When did you last learn something that took you out of your comfort zone? Just again, quick turn to the person next to you. Okay, thank you. I did something a couple of years ago that took me right out of my comfort zone. And after I'd done it, I had the opportunity to talk to some other people who had done this as well, and this is what they said to me. I felt myself getting more confident each week. It's done my confidence a world of good. I feel so much better. It should be almost compulsory for building self-esteem. I didn't expect to feel different inside as a result of doing it. If I can do that, there'd be very little that I shouldn't now be able to handle. Now I've done something difficult. Maybe I could do other things. Anyone want to have a guess as to what it was I did? Do call out. Bungee jumping. I'm a physical scaredy cat, but that sounds like a very, very good one.
Learning another language.
Learning another language. Increasingly challenging as we get older, right? You wouldn't believe it. You really wouldn't believe it from the person that you see standing here, because I am not doing a routine for you. I went for 7 weeks to a comedy school to do a stand-up comedy course. No, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Damn it, damn it. And then I went back a year later to do an improvisation course. Of course, what is really interesting about this, in terms of adaptive thinking, in terms of creativity, being able to improvise, it has done a huge amount for me in terms of my reactions to situations. Now, I'm not standing here making a recommendation that every one of you goes off and does a comedy course, particularly when you can see the results standing just right in front of you, or that you do that with your staff. But thinking about those kinds of experiences that can help you do that. By the way, it's done something else very special for me, because this comedy school also has a great social mission. It has a charity mission, and it works with young people just before they go to secondary school, doing comedy to stop them from getting into knife crime. And I'm helping them now evaluate that. So it's been a double whammy for me. And that takes me into my final area, which is about well-being. We have to start with ourselves, of course, and this is true both for yourselves and for your community. And language, I think, is important. I was invited by a recently retired principal who's mentoring three new colleagues to go. I thought this was a lovely idea, to go, and he said, we'll buy you tea. I meet them once a month, and come out and have tea and cakes with us and just share some of the ideas. And these are 3 principals working in a very, very challenging part of London. And so I went out with them, and one of the words I used was nourish. And I saw visibly, these are 3 secondary principles, I saw visibly a relaxation. And I think it's really important that we nourish ourselves and others. We spend so much time in education giving. That's why we went into education. We didn't go into it for the long holidays, did we? We went into it because we were passionate. And but we need to take care of ourselves and each other, find ways to connect. I also sing. I'm also passionate, as well as doing slightly new, challenging things. I sing in a jazz choir and in a small jazz group, and that's become more and more important to me as my work has become more intense. My determination to stay true to being able to do other things, connecting, whether it's with your family, your community, and I'm talking about also working with your staff on this, staying active, bungee jumping, yes, whatever, running. A lot of people run, walking. I'm walking a lot more, Fitbitting to count my steps now, keeping on learning. And taking notice, just looking around us. I mentioned mindfulness, the opportunity just to spend time breathing, quiet time walking around the block. You owe it to yourselves. I have a very, very wonderful hairdresser. I'm always nervous when I talk about hairdressers because I always think about how much of Margaret Thatcher's policy was determined by what her hairdresser happened to say to her when she went to the hairdresser. But my hairdresser had connected with a young man from India, and they went into his children's primary school first thing in the morning to offer yoga for half an hour to parents, to children, to staff. So all those ways to well-being. The Eden Project in Cornwall is both thinking about educational future about our planet. It's a social enterprise. I don't know if any of you have been there. Tim Smith, who designed it, has various rules for what people need to do. And one thing is, don't start work until you've talked to at least, connected with at least 20 people. Once a year, cook a meal for 40 people who have really made a difference to you. Make sure that you go and listen to some music, that you read 2 books that are different. They have an annual drumming event. Your community well-being list may well be different from that, but what would it be? So really, creating capacity for learning is continuing to inquire, getting those knowledge workers, ensuring that we're creative professional learning communities, that we're growing catalysts, but that we're taking care of ourselves. And I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday because I was with the South Australian secondary principals, but I'm here for the rest of the day and I shall look forward to connecting with you. Thank you very much.